The Giant Killers by Conway Fitzgerald. Chapter 16.
Theb approached the keep of the Ostrom cautiously. He had been there many times in his long life. However, this was the first time his presence there had been requested. He made several rounds outside the keep, observing comings and goings, searching for anything that didn't look quite right. While I was being incarcerated in Tel Suma, he was free to try and add a few coins to his own purse. Despite the chest Gareth gave us, Theb was still reeling from the fortune we'd lost in Bishopsgate. That loss included nearly 200 years worth of illicit money and priceless treasures we had accumulated in our secret guild fortress under that keep. Money that was earned at great risk and at great expense, bought with blood and guile. Even with the best of Oral's lucky gaze, it would take centuries to reacquire that much wealth. Word leaked through some of our old contacts that Taggart, the new Earl of the Ostrom, was looking to have a threat removed. An upstart robber knight, an unbending feudal lord, unwilling to accept Taggart's ascension to power. Word was Taggart was willing to pay quite a bit of untraceable cash to make this threat go away. It had been 4 years since the great invasion of the giant horde came eastward, with all the human suffering and stifling of trade that came in its wake. Money for high-level clandestine jobs like effective rogue intimidation were in very short supply. Expendable cash for things like assassination of lords were even harder jobs to come by. Hopefully, now that law in the Three Kingdoms was beginning to be restored to the south, commerce would also stabilize. The human King Owen appeared to be backed up adequately by the wealth and vast armies of the three empires. Confidence was returning slowly to the countryside. Certain men of ambition saw this as their moment to assert themselves, or the time to stave off the conniving aspirations of others. Theb was happy to help the highest bidder achieve either aim. The cloak made his way past the keep's guards and into the town without notice, walking by them invisibly among a caravan of merchant carriages that had been permitted entry after close inspection. The keep had been on lockdown and was still on a war footing. The Ostrom had no evident damage of any giant invasion. The stronghold and its walls were completely intact. Theb made his way around the village, circling about, observing all the passers-by, once again comparing patiently the traffic with his expectations. With no clear irregularities detected, he circled one last time, stopping before an unremarkable wooden door within a dark, secluded alleyway. When he was certain no one was looking, he knocked twice quickly, revealing himself from his cloak of invisibility. A slot in the door opened.
"What say you?"
spoke faceless lips, barely visible on the other side of the door slot.
"A wolf hunts the sheep,"
Theb retorted with his cold, elvish tone. The slot closed again quickly. Theb looked to either side of him for trouble. A few long seconds later, the door opened. The faceless lips were shown to be a heavy-set dwarf with a big gray beard. Theb recognized him as Herf's cousin, Medwin.
"You're early,"
said Medwin.
"Well, I'm here. And if I leave, I'm not coming back,"
said Theb, walking past him impatiently. He inspected the room, which was the small office of the tavern on the other side of the building. There were 3 other unexpected people in the room, one of which Theb knew. He was Gurmley, a Havling cutthroat Theb had employed before. Gurmley acknowledged him with expected caution. The other 2 were human men Theb did not know. They looked young and out of place. Theb pulled a chair and sat down at the table where the two humans played cards. They grabbed their cards defensively, surprised by the invasive move. Theb spoke in monotone.
I don't know you. Who are you?
Well, the feeling is mutual. I don't know you either,
said the punky boy confidently.
You first. Who the hell are you?
We don't do names here.
Medwin insisted, bringing some wine in a bottle over to Theb. Theb waved him off.
What will you have?
Medwin asked Theb, who was still locked in a stare-down with the two human boys.
Answers,
Theb said coldly and unapologetically. The two young human men put down their cards and beer mugs as they sized up the gray elf. Before Medwin could offer an ice-breaking joke, the first human spoke again.
The name's Eisen. This is my brother, Bert. We're from Altendor. You might have heard. It got all smashed up by the snow giants. Our turf was destroyed, so our gang fled south, looting houses and robbing the stragglers along the roads. My brother and I heard there may be some real money to be made down here in Ostrom. We're both solid thieves and experienced killers, Grey Man. Is that enough of an answer for you?
No, it isn't,
Theb said coldly.
Well then, who the hell are you, elf?
Asked Eisen. His brother stood up from his chair slowly and stepped closer behind his brother.
I don't care who you are. I don't want to know. I want to know what the hell you are doing here.
Just then a door opened to the other side of Theb. Another dwarf, Medwin's brother Sherma, opened the door. Sherman was a respected thief and a master lockcracker. He was the one Theb expected to see on the other side of the first door, not these men. Sherma called out.
Come, Cloak. He'll see you now.
Theb stood up slowly and walked past Sherma without a word, only a stern glare of warning. Theb was promised an upfront payment, plus information and details of this hit by the payer for the Earl. The payer was an anonymous patron, someone none of them had ever met, and that made Theb nervous. But in his desperation for money, he trusted Sherma. That was a mistake, for just like Theb, any side could buy a thief's loyalty for the right price. Theb approached in a smaller office where a busy human man had his back to him, shuffling through papers behind his bureau. Theb turned his head briefly, and Sherma closed the door, leaving them alone. Then the man turned to face Theb. It was Thon. Theb was exceptionally quick, and Thon expected that. Before Theb could even reach to draw his broadsword, Thon kicked a latch by his feet, which fired a crossbow that had been installed into the face of the bureau. Without a moment lost, even to exchange a word or a subtle countenance, the hidden crossbow launched a cable with two metal weights attached on either side. As designed, they swung about Theb's waist and whipped around his small frame, ensnaring his body before he could employ his superhuman dexterity. Somehow, despite being totally ensnared, Theb managed to keep his feet and sneak his wiry hands out and away from the cables holding his arms and hips. Meanwhile, using only his tiptoes, he scampered back to the wall and began an incantation. Thon leapt towards him, tackling him, and then placing his hand firmly over the elf's mouth.
Oh, no you don't.
Theb was always ready for this kind of ambush. Or so he thought. The other two humans entered the room to find Thon had the cloak firmly in custody. Thon then began the true business at hand. Interrogation.
Now, let's talk about our friend. That red-headed half-elf, Ermine. Where is she?
He demanded. The mood in Torbana had been quite tense since Owen's return. Ivan refused to be evicted from the palace without recompense. As such, there was very little common ground for either side to reach. At first, the army of Owen's three kingdoms remained stationed outside the walls of the citadel, embarrassed, angered, and confused. Gathered within Owen's newly returned army were many powerful generals, aristocrats, and delegates of the great Eastern Empire. This first impression was not a good look. Ramthar's army of the East was closing in behind, now only days away. Through skilled diplomacy, King Owen, his brothers, and their large retinue were finally allowed to return to their proper place of governed birthright, within their sacked palaces and ravaged city homes. Ivan and his men took other quarters outside the palace, begrudgingly. The night Dan returned to Torbana was designed to be a very special occasion. For the very first time, it was arranged and agreed that all of the kings, lords, and their retainers, who had traveled half the world to be here, would meet in Owen's Great Hall for a formal feast and make a declaration of peace and cooperation. Here at this meeting, these men of power would come face to face for the first time. At this feast, it was hoped they could all openly discuss this historic war with the giants and the profitable peace among men that was soon to follow. That was hoped, but it was difficult to know what to really expect. Khan and Theos utilized their best arguments with the unrefined diplomatic skills of the respected knights Keontan and Reg. It was a painstaking diplomatic effort to make this event happen. As soon as Owen and his family were allowed back inside the castle, the time would be short before there would be more threats of violence. That is when Khan finally found Dan and retrieved him. With Fergo still missing, the White Flame wanted their most influential man to be present and prepped for the world stage. Khan led Dan to his quarters, where a bath was drawn, with a barber standing by. There were several fashionable suits of fine Torbanian style, and a talented custom tailor on call beside them. The tailor smiled at Dan as he displayed his wares proudly. Dan smiled back, still taking off pieces of his thick, blood-soaked animal skins that were now wet from the melted snow. Each piece of clothing removed brought about even more intense odor. Having been alone in the wilds for several weeks, these stylists had a great deal of grooming to do to make Dan look presentable. But while he was bathed, groomed, and clothed, Dan voiced some demands of his own.
Where is Thon? Why isn't he here? There's likely to be every cutthroat of the known world here tonight as well,
he said, unsettling the hairdressers. They had removed Dan's overgrowth brilliantly. Satisfied with their work, Khan handed the she-men coins and then shooed them out briskly.
I hope that's real money you're giving them, and not that conjured-up stuff again.
The hairdressers, who by trade overhear and seem to understand every spoken word, no matter the dialect, looked back confused as Khan slammed the door behind them. Dan laughed out loud. As he finished buttoning his bright blue vest, Dan felt awkward. He was uncomfortable wearing such expensive civilian clothing. He looked into the mirror before him, which reflected a magnificently handsome prince, though in his own mind, he preferred the visage of the street brawler turned armored warrior. Dan was a great fighter and committed to fighting for justice. That was his sense of self. But it was his astonishing comeliness, his unique powers of persuasion, and undeniable charisma that would be needed so desperately. It would have to be on full display before the greatest leaders of men. Tonight, he was to be a diplomat.
I have news. Thon is well. He's captured the cloak, the half-elf's protector,
Khan said, dusting off Dan's shoulder, and then straightening the buttons and scarf atop Dan's white tunic.
He did?
Dan smiled incredulously, nearly in disbelief at the achievement. Over these many years together, Thon had grown in power greatly, but Dan had known Theb even longer than he'd known Thon, and had seen the cloak dodge a lot of very experienced rangers.
Is she alive? What happened to...
The great seer lives,
Smiled Khan.
She did it. She got Fergus to tell Suma that druidic magic cured him, as she promised, and he is well.
Dan smiled with Khan.
That's great news. Incredible news. Well, where are they? Why should I be doing all the talking?
Khan took his hands off Dan's shoulder and stepped back.
Anytime you deal with elves, it's, how does she say, complicated,
Khan said. Dan shook his head and pursed his lips, unsatisfied with that explanation.
What Ermine did was, well, against their elvish law. She could be killed for it.
Khan looked back to Dan with much empathy.
Killed for it?
Dan felt powerless and angry. We had endured so much together. He was so saddened to think that I had taken his high priest, the great seer, and saved him. In so doing, I had potentially sacrificed my own long life for his pious friend and leader. Dan later asked me why I did it, surely knowing the answer already. It was true what Fergus had told him. I loved him. I would do anything for him.
So what's Thon doing? Why can't we hear Fergus or see him? Is he a prisoner as well?
Not exactly.
Khan smirked.
As I said, it's complicated. Thon is negotiating. We're hopeful.
Khan smiled.
You're hopeful. That's good.
Dan nodded sarcastically, surprised by their apparent feckless approach towards Nuna. But Khan distracted him. He focused his attention into his own eyes.
Dan, this is important. We represent the Order now. We're all that's left. We need to hold this together. Help us broker a peace. Thanks be to Fergus's wisdom and the mercy of his old father. We know all the players, personally.
Dan was primarily a man of the fighting world, but was also an experienced confidence man, having spent nearly 8 years working with me and my Thieves Guild. I had taught him to question every man's intentions, to understand their motivations, and thereby know how to steer their thoughts where you wanted them. Because of that, Dan was very dubious of this mission. These were powerful men gathered from all over the world. They were leaders of many angry and unsatisfied fighting men that spoke in many uncommon dialects. This was a volatile situation.
We just need to align our intentions,
Khan lectured, gesturing his hands together.
And what are those? Whose intentions? Which line do we follow? Has Fergus given us any direction?
Dan's questions cut through Khan's pretense. Khan had to appeal to Dan's street smarts.
King Owen made promises that he will have to deliver on. Somehow, or there will be consequences. Obviously, he can't do that now. We must assure Ivan and the others that he intends to.
And what's the intention of the Eastern Empire? What did Ramthar promise them?
Dan asked.
Simple. A restoration of business. To open the trade lanes and end the trade war and thwart the bandit attacks across the central desert. If they help us do this, they need to have potent and lasting interests here. That is what Owen must also reassure them of.
Okay. Sounds good. I think I got it. Yeah.
Dan said. He nodded and smiled confidently. Khan looked pleased.
So does His Highness, King Owen, agree with us on all of this?
Dan asked as Khan's face turned to stone.
Not entirely.
It was clear now to Dan that Con and Theos, though brilliant minds, had failed to gain any kind of true consensus here. They both came off far too intellectually aloof for any of these great leaders' palates. Particularly Owen, who despite being nearly ruined financially, was still a very assertive personality and influential leader. Reg and Keontan were far too proper and unwilling to drink with the royals and aristocracy like normal men do. This created an uncomfortable distance, and thus mistrust. Dan was clearly the piece of the puzzle so desperately missing here. Con and Theos were absolutely right about that. They needed Dan's charisma. It was he that would have to sell this piece before the outbreak of civil war consumed all of humanity. News of his arrival in Torbana reached both kings, Ivan and Owen, nearly simultaneously, and they both summoned Dan for personal meetings soon thereafter. Their angling for political advantage had already begun. Dan thanked both messengers for the invitations and reminded them both politely he would be attending the dinner conference that night. Dan then went down and inspected the hall, which had been restored remarkably by the two wizards, and the busy work of the king's newly restored retainers and servants. There were linens that were hastily woven on the large oak tables that were arranged in a large U shape. Each of the three corners had a heightened dais behind the main table, on which each leader would be offered a higher vantage place, representative of their power. Dan was impressed how well and how fast they had cleaned and gathered this place to be so presentable. He was also impressed by the striking beauty of the large colored tapestries that adorned each section, meant to signify the place of each kingdom at this prestigious meeting with true dignity. He reached to touch one of the cotton tapestries, and then found it was not expensive cloth at all, but pure illusion. It was glamorous window dressing performed by his wizard allies. His hand passed right through it, and he touched the naked rock of the wall behind.
We just didn't have enough cloth or seamstresses on hand to manufacture a few 100-foot tapestries together in a day.
Khan chuckled.
I hope they're not all as inquisitive as you.
Oh, they will be.
Best to let their personal guard know what you've done and why.
Dan suggested. Without Thon here, Dan was compelled to do what he thought the ranger would: inspect, secure, and assure.
Absolutely. Good idea.
Smiled Khan back at him. Just then, some of the local clergy of Torbana's high priest entered. They immediately began complaining to Khan over the lack of a prestigious place for the bishop, and why there was no commencement prayer scheduled. Fortunately for Khan, Reg and Keontan arrived to intercept and offer a suitable place and a promise of prayer. That was something Dan could never emulate, the work of Fergus. The two paladins placated the clergymen, and then both came over to greet Dan.
He has returned. What say you, Tenuvil?
Asked the mighty Keontan. They embraced.
Look at you both. They've got you dressed as ridiculously as me.
Dan laughed.
Wow, you really let that barber go to work on you.
Dan said, lamenting the loss of Keontan's mighty golden locks.
So where will you two be seated?
We came to tell you. We must leave.
Said Keontan with slight remorse.
The Great Seer lives. We must now aid Thon in arranging his release and escort him back here.
Well, you are his shield men, after all.
Dan nodded in approval.
Dan, your friend,
The half-elf girl.
Reg said.
She's actually about 200 years old, but yeah, I was told.
Dan frowned.
We will claim her as our own.
Reg said.
She is one of us now. What she did, she has proven herself. She is courageous and trustworthy.
Reg looked to Keontan, who nodded in approval. It was at that moment I became part of their order. Dan was ecstatic.
Thank you, brothers. That means a lot to me.
Dan emoted.
So will you manage here?
Reg asked.
Well, it appears I must. You two know how to escape a pit of vipers, that's for sure.
Dan smirked.
Khan is here, with you, to help.
Reg offered.
We have confidence. You are the right man to do this.
Kiontan said with his northern accent. Dan put up his hand dismissively.
Just go. But return, quickly. I don't know how much more of this I can take.
Dan said, smiling. He embraced them both, and the paladins shared a blessing with their old friend. They then left the city with Theos, and started on their way north to the Ostrom, to join Thon and negotiate the release of Fergus, and if possible, beg that my life might be spared. That night, the large hall filled slowly with representatives of the most powerful political leaders in the known world. At the head table, beside the dais that was his rightful throne, King Owen was seated with his brothers, Geoffrey and Alan, governors of the land of Rufus and Paraman. Behind them were the golden colors of the three kingdoms, each kingdom symbolized by an eagle for Torbana, a dragon for Rufus, and a lion for Paraman. To their right was the place of the northern kingdoms, led by Ivan of Tonderland. Their colors were bright blue, with the historic emblems of the lands of Ebok, Tull, and Artendal also represented. Though there were very few nobles from these lands that had survived the onslaught of the frost giants, Ivan was now representative of all the Northlands, a prestigious leap in power and influence for the young Tonder King. To the left of Owen's entourage were the tables and dais of the Great Eastern Empire. These were bright red tapestries with hypnotic artistic designs that had caught Dan's eye. They were represented by Kalang To of Chalpachare. He was not a king or an emperor, but the high emissary for the emperor, Gilgara. His place was made to be equal to that of Owen and Ivan's, out of respect for his emperor, and out of fear for its mighty armies that continued their steady march westwards. Dan was seated in the blue section as part of the northern delegation. Ivan did not hesitate to reseat Dan closer to him, up on the dais, when he arrived.
Dan, I can't believe it, but it's true. You're alive.
I am, Highness, and with many great stories to tell.
Dan smiled.
Of that, I am sure.
Ivan wasted no time. He toasted Dan and announced loudly over the minstrel's song.
Dan Tinuvial, the first man to reach the end of the world and come back.
Boasted Ivan to the cheers of his men and faint applause to the other tables across the great hall, most of which could not hear what he said. Ivan sat down with Dan and then spoke directly to him, for his ears only.
I am glad you are here. It seems this king, Owen of Torbana, does not understand what a pledge is. We must make sure that he does.
We will,
answered Dan confidently. Ivan smiled and grunted with approval, gaining a perceived political victory. Dan's answer was specifically vague enough. Ivan then ordered more ale. Alcohols from all over the world were there, all available to be tasted. Rarely would any man, king or otherwise, have such a worldly selection of finely cooked food, drink, and entertainment as this. The Dreshy female dance troupe were particularly amusing for all the men present. Ivan and Dan gawked at their nearly naked bodies and astonishing acrobatic movements.
Dan, that's very tempting. These women of the East, very tempting indeed. but none can match the warmth and sweetness of the Thunder Tit. Am I right?
He boasted, laughing aloud. Evidently, both Dan and Thon had enjoyed quite a bit of unscrupulous sex with many women while under Ivan's auspices. These northern people were much more deviant and promiscuous than most cultures. That is what Dan told me, though Thon would never admit to it. Later, the debutantes arrived. All the prettiest young noble women of the Three Kingdoms made grand entrances, with powdered faces and in their finest dresses. Their pretty faces were finely painted in rouge, shadow, and mascara. All of their accentuated eyes latched onto Dan's. They whispered amongst each other as they looked in his direction. He was certainly the most eligible bachelor in the world at that time. Ivan noticed as so many were trying desperately to draw his attention, indulging in any act or opportunity they could think of to catch even his briefest gaze. Ivan rested his arm on Dan's shoulder.
You can have any one of them you want, young Dan. Just take your pick.
Laughed Ivan. Dan tried to stay focused on the issue at hand. He tried to limit his drinking and avert his eyes from his many female admirers. Khan was there, watching over him like a hawk. Before they came downstairs, Khan had also cast a magic spell for speaking in all tongues upon Dan, which enabled his words to be heard by all, in proper context, and without need of translation. After the dinner was mostly complete, the music stopped, and all were silent as a section of horns announced the host of the event. King Owen of Torbana was now going to speak. Each of the 3 tables had interpreters present to help each table understand fully what was being said.
My friends, welcome to Torbana,
Owen said, smiling. The whole room erupted in applause.
It is my great honor to host this magnificent event. It is rare, even for my brothers and I to be together in one room.
The room chuckled.
But tonight, to see our hallowed hall filled again with life, with so many kings, noblemen, and heroes, this is a great day in our history.
Once again, the room was filled with applause.
On behalf of my brothers and the people of Torbana, I wish to thank King Ivan of Thunderland for liberating our beloved city from the lawlessness that prevailed in my absence.
Ivan's men cheered and the room acknowledged Ivan. He nodded and smiled. Owen then turned his gaze to Ivan, smiled, and toasted him.
To King Ivan.
The room gave another recognition and drank to Ivan.
And to the mouth of His Excellency, Gilgara, Emperor of the Eastern Lands, the Honorable Kalong To, we offer our humble welcome to you and in honor of your great emperor.
There was an awkward silence until the interpreters finished. Then they nodded. Then Owen offered another toast.
To Chalpachare, Dresh, and the army of Promethea, welcome!
Ivan's men were not as eager to acknowledge that toast. Ivan wasn't keen on all these foreign armies finding a home here out west. Soon after Owen's thank you and welcome, Kalong To spoke in no uncertain terms.
We thank you, King Owen, for your welcome. It is our hope that your words are not only kind, but bonded in truth and honor. We did not come all of this way for dinner and pleasantries, but to restore His Excellency's interests in the great Western Expanse, as was pledged in the ancient times when these lands were first won and wrested from the giants. Our armies have abandoned our homelands in response to the call of a great giant reappearance, an invasion that appears to have been overstated.
There were plenty sounds made of disagreement to this notion almost immediately. When Ivan heard out his interpreter, he could not be quiet.
There are no giants because we killed them already. Without you. You can go home now.
His men cheered. It was not Ivan's allotted time to speak, so Owen and Kalong To looked over to him in slight disappointment. Dan tried to remind him to observe the procedure. Kalong To continued.
Before we return to our home again, we must demand assurances. No longer will the road through the central desert be left unguarded. No longer will the pirates of the southern sea lanes be left unmolested. Our presence here must now be permanent and supported by taxation of the lands to the benefit of the great emperor.
Once again, the hall filled with the sound of displeasure. Kalong To continued with a list of tributary demands that would be paid seasonally. These were stiff levies, and Owen and his retinue were clearly disturbed. When Ivan and Dan heard the whole list and saw Owen's reaction, they both reached separate conclusions. Dan's was that he would likely need Ramthar's help negotiating down these lofty demands. Ivan's was there was no room for him and his interests within the confines of these demands. He was ever more skeptical Owen would keep his promise and pay Ivan what he was owed. There would be war. It seemed inevitable. Since this future battlefield was closer to his home, Ivan was confident of final victory. Before Dan could attempt to placate him, Ivan spoke with conviction. He began by clapping his hands.
May I congratulate the mouth of the Emperor on his great hike through the desert. I'm certain it was accomplished on the backs of his slaves.
There was a gasp, and Dan looked down with his head in his hands.
And to Owen, fair and kind king. But king of what? These lands that were promised have been salted from use, sabotaged by the fleeing invaders. The gold you promised, all looted by raiders. Because you fled. Now those thieves and all of our just rewards have slipped into darkness. These lands to the west are now untenable, filled with roaming undead. Why? Because you fled. You ran away from your kingdom.
King Owen's retinue shouted out in protest.
It's true. While we
Ivan motioned towards Dan and himself.
fought off the giant horde and defeated the army of Quell's darkness. Now these nobles and traders arrive, claiming the spoils of war. But what spoils are there? What will you pay? How will you pay? The king will honor his commitments.
One of the brothers bellowed.
I've heard this. I have. And now I hear these men of the East arrive and claim all of this and more for themselves, simply for making the trip west. No. These lands are not yours, nor will they ever be.
The war ministers of the Eastern Empire looked at their perceived enemies with newfound animosity. He then turned to Owen.
Artendal, Tull, Ebok, Edgehurst, Voss. all besieged and struck down by the giant horde. But somehow, Bishopsgate, the Ostrom, and Torbana were spared. Why? Why did these giants only want to invade our lands, not yours, or yours?
He said, pointing to the other two tables. Ivan then pulled a large satchel from a basket one of his men had brought to him. He then emptied several large bags onto the floor of the hall for all of them to see. The stench and grotesque nature of its contents disgusted the nobles.
Behold, 497 scalps. Frost giants mostly, but also many hill giants, ogres, and trolls. This is where the horde went, honorable sir. In my bag.
He said, taunting Kalang To.
And according to my best accountants, that means you, sir, owe me nearly 5,000 pieces of gold.
He said to Owen's face.
Pay up.
After the astonished reaction and bickering of all the attendees subsided, the room fell silent. Even a pin drop could be heard. Ivan demanded an answer. That is when Dan chose to speak.
I, too, have a giant scalp. Well, it's an ear, actually,
said Dan, holding his battle helmet that he brought just in case he had to prove the giants even existed. Ivan's display, still poured out on the floor, was a bit more convincing. Dan needed to do something quick to change the tone of the meeting. By this point, he did not require an introduction. All those present knew his name.
Here, burned into my helmet, is the ear of the great hill giant chieftain, named Guth.
He showed it to all of the attendees with a smile. It was something everyone seemed interested in seeing whenever he showed it off. His voice was of a softer tone than Ivan's, and his comely smile assured the aristocrats that a brawl was not about to ensue.
It's burned into my helmet, seared into the metal itself, because after slaying him, the giant chief fell atop me. His corpse actually shielded me from the great fire as the giant fortress was being burned to cinders. I barely survived.
The room seemed anxious to hear where Dan's story was going.
Ivan is right. We've lost much. The Castle Voss, ancient castle, of all things good and just. Many great friends and good people were sacrificed in this struggle. Now is not the time or place for any of us to make demands, but instead to make assurances, to restore the covenant of the ancients, to strengthen that promise we made to each other, to humankind. We stood against the giants together, and we won, just as we did in the ancient times. Owen did what any king would do. He regrouped and returned to battle to retake his city. We just got here first.
He smiled at Ivan, who did not like where this was going.
All we ask, all we demand tonight, is for us not to forget the promise we made to each other so many centuries ago. That promise was not to agree on a stake in the spoils of victory, or our share of wealth and bounty from anyone's lands, but to join forces when the giants come. That promise was kept all of us should be grateful. We are grateful to all who heeded the call, and especially to those who gave their lives in this effort.
He turned and bowed to the red delegation of the East.
The wealth, the trade, the share of commerce for all. It's all made possible because we maintain the promise. That is the only way. Otherwise, we will all see less of everything.
Dan stopped, and the room filled with applause. Khan was in near tears, astonished by the choice and sheer alacrity of his words. A better speech he could not have writ. Dan was true speaking talent.
Thank you, young Tenuvial. You do your father's memory great service, and I can assure you, he and your gods look down with great pride at the wisdom you have learned.
Owen said, almost sneering at Ivan's petulance.
I agree with Dan. The promise must be kept, and it will be kept.
The room filled again with applause.
King Ivan, your men did come, and did indeed fight with bravery and distinction. And you did what I asked, and collected proof of your conquests. Because you also liberated our castle, I will pay you double what was promised.
Once again, the room filled with applause. When Dan later told me how Owen offered that, I figured he must have gone east mostly to obtain cash and recover old debts. His brothers did not have nearly as much control over the royal purse strings. I figured Owen had managed to obtain at least 10,000 spare pieces of gold on hand to get all of Ivan's men out of his country by the spring without a fight. Whether Owen really paid, or even squelched later, Ivan could now save face with his men and still go home victorious.
Please return in peace to your kingdom. Each year, beginning next spring, and for the next 9 springs to follow, we of Torbana will pay tribute in gold of 1,000 pieces per year, thus amounting to twice what your service to our call did claim.
Before Ivan could make more demands, Owen spoke again.
And when our serfs have repopulated and retilled the land, and our lords have cleared the undead, you may return peacefully with your people and farm these lands. The bounty of the West will be shared with our kinsmen of the North.
Ivan was contented with the offer. So far, so good, thought Dan.
His Excellency showed great mercy and wisdom by allowing these men to follow Ramthar westward for this great cause. They too will also be welcome to return to farm our lands. We will rebuild our fleet, and those ships will keep the trade lanes open. We will rebuild our cavalry, and those horsemen will drive out the brigands and free up trade with the Central Desert and the Southern Wilds. The great Emperor can be assured the Western world will be free to trade with again.
There were plenty of devils to be found amongst these details, but the gist of the agreement was accepted. A new world order for humankind was forged that night. Not only did Ivan get his first 1,000 up front, as I expected he would demand, the Eastern Empire and their trade allies promised him lucrative cuts of many goods from around the world, and buyers for his own craftsmen's work. They would pay well if the aggressors from the feudal crossroads were dealt with. That alone might have been Ivan's greatest political victory. This agreement gave him a nation of men, united in purpose, from which to fight with. If he returned home now, before one of his rivals usurped his throne, he had a means to reopen the road that connected Tonderland to the rest of the world. It was an ancient trade highway that had been closed for nearly a century. These lawless feudal lords had taken each of the dozen or so small keeps along that road beyond the mountains that led to the feudal crossroads. These keeps were designed to protect the highway, but instead became base houses for the robber knights and their cadres. Each year, these lesser lords and brigands gained increasing wealth and power by choking off these arteries of trade. But now, Ivan truly believed he could unite his armies and smash these small keeps of men, one by one, and get paid extremely well to do it. Before Dan's outstanding speech restored civility, Ivan was nearly certain a major war was about to ensue. These moneyed interests of the East were far too powerful when their armies collected, and always far too ambitious when gazing to the West. Ivan resolved they all needed to be taught a lesson in Western fortitude and resolve. But Dan's charisma and speaking talent had done more than his sword or giant strength could ever do to preserve the peace. He had averted a world war among the humans, which could have been Quell's attention all along. The giants would certainly have fared better battling mankind in the aftermath of such a war. Ivan was proud to have tutored Dan, and would speak of it up to his dying day. But for now, he was eager to take his small fortune and get home with it as soon as possible. After a brief exchange of final platitudes, Ivan, his men, money, and ships departed Torbana without a fight. Dan's perfectly articulated words had settled the hearts of all those who heard him speak. Yet his own heart remained unsettled, and his eyes once again looked to the southwest for salvation. But the promise of Fergus's and Ranthar's return kept him where he was for now.
Thanks so much for listening. If you haven't yet, please remember to subscribe and ring the bell for notifications. Be sure to leave your comments below. And of course, share with all your friends on social media.